The cold had a weight to it, a physical presence that settled deep in the bones and stayed there. Flint felt it in the floorboards of his small, sturdy house, in the handle of the iron stove, and in the silence that pressed in from the vast, snow-dusted plains of Wyoming. For 3 days, he had been waiting. The letter from the agency in Cheyenne had been terse, promising a hired hand, a man named Miller, strong-backed and not afraid of a winter's work. He needed the help. The north fence line was down in 3 places, and the coming storms promised to be brutal. He stood by the window, a mug of coffee warming his palms, and watched the horizon. It was a habit born of solitude, scanning the immense emptiness for any change, any disruption. And then he saw it. Not the sturdy figure on horseback he expected, but a smaller shape, dark against the snow, moving with a slow, determined trudge. It was on foot. Miles from the nearest stage stop. A knot of irritation tightened in his gut. This was not Miller. As the figure drew closer, the irritation soured into disbelief. It was a woman. No, a girl, really. She wore a thin, grey prairie dress, inadequate for the biting wind, and a threadbare shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She was Chinese, her face pale and pinched with cold, her dark hair pulled back in a severe knot. She carried a small, battered satchel. When she finally reached his porch, her steps were faltering, her breath pluming in white clouds. She stopped before his door but didn't knock, as if waiting for permission to exist. Flint opened it, letting a wave of precious warmth escape into the frigid air. He looked down at her, at the smudges of dirt on her cheek, the exhaustion etched around her eyes. Pinned to her dress was a note, a cruel, mocking little flag. He pulled it free. The script was crude. A gift for the solitary man. From your friends at the Union Pacific. We hear you need a wife. This one's quiet. It wasn't from the agency. It was from the railroad men he'd run off his land last month. This was their joke. They had sent him this girl, this child, as an insult. She looked up at him, her gaze direct, unblinking, holding no plea, only a deep, unnerving stillness. She was not what he wanted. She was a problem he had no time for. Get inside, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Before you freeze solid. She moved past him into the single room of the cabin, her eyes taking in everything at once, the stone fireplace, the neat stack of wood, the rifle resting on its pegs above the mantel, the single cot, the sparse, functional order of his life. She set her satchel down by the door with a quiet finality, as if she had arrived at the end of a very long road. Flint closed the door, shutting out the vast, hostile white of the world. The silence inside was different now, occupied. He felt like a bear whose cave had been invaded by a field mouse. His plan had been simple: give her a hot meal, let her sleep by the fire, and in the morning, he'd ride her to the stage stop himself and send her back to whatever hell she'd come from. He would not be the punchline to a railroad crew's joke. He ladled stew into a bowl and set it on the small table. Eat, he commanded, not looking at her. She sat, her movements economical and precise, and ate without a word. He watched her from the corner of his eye. Her hands, when she wrapped them around the warm bowl, were not the soft, useless hands of a pampered girl. They were chapped and calloused, her knuckles scarred. He saw a flicker of something in her expression as the warmth of the food hit her, not gratitude, but a grim, focused relief, the look of a starving animal that has finally found sustenance. When she finished, she stood, took the bowl to the wash basin, and began to clean it with a practiced efficiency that startled him. She didn't ask. She just did. She moved around his small space as if she understood its rhythms, stacking the firewood tighter, wiping down the table with a damp rag. He had expected tears, or fear, or some kind of plea. He got none of it. He got only this quiet, unnerving competence. "What's your name?" he asked, the words feeling loud in the stillness. She paused, her back to him, and for a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. "Lynn," she said, her voice low and clear, with no trace of an accent. Just a name, offered like a stone. He gave her a blanket and pointed to the floor near the hearth. It was the warmest spot in the house. You can sleep there, he told her. Tomorrow, I'm taking you back. She gave a single, sharp nod, wrapped herself in the scratchy wool, and settled down without complaint, turning her face toward the fire. Flint retreated to his cot, but sleep wouldn't come. The house felt smaller, the air charged with her presence. He lay in the dark, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the sound of her breathing, slow and even. She was a stray, a complication sent by his enemies. But there was something about her stillness, her self-containment, that was not the mark of a victim. It was the mark of a survivor. He thought of the note again. This one's quiet. They meant it as an insult, a suggestion of docility, of weakness. But as he lay there, listening to the absolute lack of fear in the rhythm of her breath, he began to suspect they had made a terrible mistake. The quiet wasn't empty. It was full. It was weighted. The next morning, he woke before dawn to the smell of coffee. She was already up, the fire built high, a pot brewing over the flames. She had found his stores, ground the beans, and started the day without him. He sat up, and she turned, holding out a steaming mug. Her eyes were clear, the exhaustion of the previous day replaced by a sharp, alert intelligence. He took the coffee. Their fingers brushed. Her skin was cold, but her grip was firm. The north fence needs mending, he said, testing her. It's a two-man job. He expected her to look away, to show some sign that she understood this was not her place. Instead, she met his gaze. I have worked with wire, she said simply. The statement hung in the air between them, another offered stone, solid and real. He had a choice. He could stick to his plan, rid himself of this complication, and go back to his solitary battle against the winter and the railroad. Or he could accept this strange, unexpected offer of an alliance. He looked out the window at the snow, heavy and deep. He looked at her, small and determined in her thin grey dress. He drained his coffee in one long swallow. Get your coat, he said. It's a long walk. The riders came near dusk, 4 of them, materializing out of the swirling snow like ghosts. Flint saw them from the rise where he and Lynn were stretching the last line of wire tight. They weren't drifters. They were company men, their horses strong, their coats new. The man in the lead was Barrett, a foreman whose face was a roadmap of cheap whiskey and casual cruelty. Flint had met him before. He straightened up, his hand falling instinctively to the pistol at his hip. Lynn, who had been focused on twisting the wire with a pair of pliers, went utterly still. She didn't look at the riders. She looked at the ground, her shoulders tightening, her whole body coiling like a spring. Go back to the house, Flint said, his voice low. Barricade the door. She didn't move. She watched him, her dark eyes searching his face. Go, he repeated, more forcefully. This time, she obeyed, turning and moving down the hill with a speed that belied her small frame, never once looking back. Barrett and his men reined in a few feet away, their horses stamping impatiently in the snow. Hard at work, Flint, Barrett said, a lazy smile not reaching his eyes. That's good. A man should take pride in what he's about to lose. Flint didn't answer, his gaze steady. The company's offer still stands. $500. It's more than this worthless patch of rock is worth. It's not for sale, Flint said flatly. Barrett's smile vanished. Everything is for sale. You're just being stupid about the price. We need this land for the spur line. We're going to get it. The easy way, or the hard way. He gestured vaguely toward the cabin. So you got some company. The boys sent you their regards, I see. Hope she's keeping you warm. The casual, proprietary way he spoke of her lit a cold fire in Flint's chest. Before he could answer, one of the other riders, a younger man with a nervous twitch, urged his horse forward. Let's just get it over with, Barrett. As he spoke, something small and dark flashed through the air from the direction of the woodpile near the cabin. It moved with impossible speed, a blur against the grey sky, and embedded itself with a solid thunk in the thick pommel of the young rider's saddle, inches from his leg. It was one of Flint's own hatchets. The rider's horse shied violently, screaming, and the man yelled in shock. All 4 men stared at the quivering handle, then toward the cabin, where Lynn stood half concealed by the stacked logs, another hatchet held loosely in her other hand. Barrett's face was a mask of disbelief, then fury. He looked from Lynn to Flint, his eyes narrowed with a new, dangerous understanding. This wasn't the joke he thought it was. "You'll regret that," he snarled, pulling his horse back. Both of you. They wheeled their horses around and galloped away, swallowed by the snow and the growing darkness. Flint stood frozen for a long moment, the cold forgotten. He looked down at his cabin, at the small figure who had just declared war on the Union Pacific Railroad with a single, perfectly aimed throw. She was not a victim. She was a weapon. And she was on his side. They came back after midnight. The moon was a sliver behind thick clouds, and the world was black and white and silent, the new snow muffling all sound. Flint was awake, sitting in the dark, his rifle across his lap. He had known they would not wait long. The hatchet had been an insult Barrett couldn't ignore. Lynn was not asleep. She sat on the floor by the cold hearth, sharpening the second hatchet on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound in the room. The first shot was a deafening crack that shattered the window above the wash basin. Glass exploded inward. Flint was already moving, kicking the table on its side for cover, yelling at Lynn. "Get down!" She didn't flinch. She dropped the hatchet and crawled toward the wall beside the fireplace, pressing herself flat. Another shot tore a splintered hole in the cabin door. They weren't trying to intimidate him anymore. They were trying to kill him. He sighted down the barrel of his rifle, waiting for a muzzle flash, a shadow moving against the snow. He saw one and fired, the recoil jolting his shoulder. A muffled cry from outside told him he'd hit something. "How many?" Lynn's voice was a low whisper from the shadows. For before, he grunted, reloading. Could be more now. He risked a glance out the broken window. He could see them, dark shapes using the barn and the fence line for cover. They were settling in for a siege. "They want to wait us out," he said. Wait for dawn. They sat in the tense silence, punctuated by sporadic gunfire. The bullets chewed at the log walls of the cabin, each impact a heavy, sickening thud. He was pinned. There were too many angles to cover. It was in that moment, in the suffocating quiet between gunshots, that she spoke. "They are not here for your land," she said, her voice tight with a tension that went beyond the immediate danger. "Not just for the land." Flint kept his eyes on the darkness outside. "What are you talking about?" "My name is not Lynn," she whispered. The confession was so quiet he almost missed it. "That is the name of the girl who died in my place. I was a clerk at the railroad camp in Carbon. I kept the books." A bullet slammed into the doorframe above his head, showering him with splinters. "You've got a hell of a time to be telling stories." "I am not telling a story," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate urgency. "Barrett. He runs the camps. They cheat the workers. They steal their wages. Men who complain. They disappear. I saw it. I wrote it all down. I have the ledgers. The real ones." She reached into the lining of her battered satchel and pulled out a slim, oilskin-wrapped package. "This is why they sent me to you. They thought you were a broken man, isolated. They thought you would use me, break me, or kill me. And they would come and collect the books from my body. They are not here for you, Flint. They are here for me." The entire world shifted on its axis. Every piece fell into a new, terrifying place. The joke, the riders, Barrett's fury, it wasn't about a patch of land. It was about this girl and the truth she carried. He was no longer a rancher defending his home. He was a shield for a witness, caught in the middle of a war he hadn't known he was fighting. He looked at her, at the fierce, frightened determination in her eyes, and he understood. He was her last line of defense. And she was his. The attack intensified. They were no longer probing, but pressing, a coordinated assault from three sides. Bullets ripped through the thin walls, turning his home into a death trap. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and shattered pine. Flint fired methodically, conserving his shots, making each one count. But for every shadow he targeted, 2 more seemed to move in the periphery. Lynn was a blur of motion in the darkness, crawling from the satchel to his side, pressing fresh cartridges into his hand before he even realized he was empty. Her presence was a steadying force in the chaos. She didn't speak, didn't cry out. She just acted, her small hands working with a speed and certainty that was mesmerizing. "Window on the left," she hissed, and he swung the rifle, firing at a muzzle flash she had seen before he did. "I see him," he grunted back. 3 more, by the barn. They are trying to flank us. To get to the back wall. It is the weakest. She was right. He had built the cabin with its back to the prevailing wind, never considering it would need to withstand a firefight. He moved to the small rear window, peering into the inky blackness. He could hear them, whispering, the crunch of their boots on the snow. He fired into the sound, and was answered by a volley of shots that tore through the wall around him. He felt a searing pain in his arm, a bullet grazing his flesh, and he swore, stumbling back. Lynn was there instantly. "You are hit, it's nothing," he lied, reloading with clumsy fingers. The battle became a blur of noise and instinct. The small cabin was their entire world, a tiny island of defiance in an ocean of violence. He and Lynn moved around the wreckage of the table and chairs, a grim, synchronized dance of survival. He was the firepower, she was the eyes, the support, the silent partner who anticipated his every need. In the middle of the chaos, he was struck by the sheer absurdity of it. 2 days ago, she had been a stranger, an unwanted complication. Now, he was trusting her with his life, and she was trusting him with hers. The trust wasn't spoken. It was in the way she slapped a loaded rifle into his hand, the way he shifted his body to shield her as he fired, the shared glances in the flash of gunfire that said everything that needed to be said. They were no longer 2 separate people. They were a single unit, a 2-headed creature of defense and survival, fighting for their small, shared patch of ground. A heavier, rhythmic thumping started against the back wall. "What is that?" she asked, her voice tight. Flint knew the sound. "An axe," he said grimly. "They're coming through the wall." A length of wood splintered inward, then another. They were chopping their way in. Flint fired through the growing hole, but it was a desperate, useless gesture. Then he heard a different sound, a fizzing hiss from outside the front door. "Get back," he roared, shoving Lynn toward the rear of the cabin. A stick of dynamite, its fuse glowing like a malevolent red eye, had been wedged into the doorframe. He had only a second. He threw himself sideways, pulling her down behind the stone hearth just as the world erupted in a cataclysm of light and sound. The explosion blew the door and a section of the front wall into the cabin. Splinters and debris rained down on them. A wave of concussive force stole the air from their lungs. Through the ringing in his ears, Flint heard a man shout in triumph. "Barrett!" He was coming through the breach. Flint pushed himself up, his rifle lost in the darkness and wreckage. He drew his pistol, but his vision was blurred, his head spinning. He saw Barrett's silhouette in the ragged opening, a rifle raised, aimed directly at him. Time slowed. He knew he wouldn't be fast enough. Then Lynn moved. She launched herself from the floor, a small, grey blur, and slammed into Flint's side, knocking him off balance. He stumbled, falling hard against the wall. At the same instant, Barrett's rifle cracked, the sound impossibly loud inside the room. Lynn cried out, a sharp, broken sound of pain, and collapsed onto the floor. The sight of her falling, of the dark stain spreading across the shoulder of her dress, broke something inside Flint. A cold, black rage washed over him, clearing his head, sharpening his focus. He raised his pistol and fired twice. The first shot took Barrett in the chest, the second in the throat. The big man staggered backward, a look of profound surprise on his face, and then he was gone, falling out into the snow. The other attackers, seeing their leader fall, hesitated. It was all the opening Flint needed. He scrambled forward, grabbing the rifle from Barrett's fallen body, and unleashed a volley of shots into the darkness. He didn't aim. He fired with pure, protective fury. He heard panicked shouts, the sound of men running, their boots crunching in the snow as they retreated. And then, silence. A profound, ringing silence, broken only by the whisper of the wind through the hole where his door used to be. The attack was over. For now. He dropped the rifle and crawled to Lynn. The cabin was a ruin. Moonlight, cold and unforgiving, streamed through the gaping hole in the wall, illuminating a scene of total destruction. Shards of glass, splintered wood, and spent cartridges littered the floor. The air was acrid with the lingering smell of gunpowder and dynamite. Flint ignored it all. He knelt beside Lynn, his hands gentle as he turned her over. The bullet had torn through the fleshy part of her shoulder. It was bleeding badly, staining the grey fabric of her dress a deep, glistening black in the moonlight. Her face was pale, her eyes closed, but she was breathing. Relief, sharp and painful, pierced through the rage and adrenaline. He lifted her as carefully as he could and carried her to the one corner of the room that remained untouched, laying her on the blankets near the hearth. He lit a lantern, the small, steady flame pushing back the shadows, creating an intimate circle of light in the midst of the wreckage. Her eyes fluttered open as he began to cut away the fabric of her dress from the wound. They were dark with pain, but clear. "He is dead," she whispered, her voice raspy. "He's dead," Flint confirmed, his voice low and raw. He worked quickly, his hands surprisingly steady. He had tended to his own wounds, to livestock, but this was different. This was a wound taken for him. Every touch was fraught with a weight he had never experienced. He cleaned the wound with whiskey from his flask, earning a sharp hiss of pain from her, and packed it with clean rags. She never cried out again, though he could see the effort it took her to remain still, her jaw clenched, a fine sheen of sweat on her brow. As he worked, the silence between them was no longer tense or wary. It was something else entirely. It was the quiet of a shared trauma, of a debt that could never be spoken of. He had seen her competence, her courage. Now, he was seeing her vulnerability. The fierce survivor was also a young woman, wounded and in pain, far from home. He finished bandaging her shoulder, his touch lingering for a moment longer than necessary on the clean white cloth. He looked at her face, truly looked at her, not as a problem or an ally, but as a person. The railroad men had called her ugly. They were fools. In the warm lantern light, with her hair loose from its severe knot, her face pale and etched with pain but also with an unbreakable strength, she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He pulled a blanket over her. "Rest," he said. The single word was freighted with everything he couldn't say. "Thank you, I'm sorry, you're safe." She looked at him, and for the first time, the guarded stillness in her eyes softened, replaced by a flicker of profound, weary trust. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her. Flint sat beside her, his rifle across his knees, and watched over her as the long, cold night wore on. The fight was not over, but something had fundamentally changed. This was no longer just his house. And she was no longer a stranger. They spent the next day in a state of grim preparation. The lull was a gift, a temporary reprieve they both knew wouldn't last. The railroad company would not let the death of a foreman and the loss of the ledgers go unanswered. They would send more men, better armed, and this time they would not stop until the cabin was ash and they were both silenced. Flint worked on the house, boarding up the broken window and the gaping hole in the wall with planks torn from the barn. The repairs were crude, ugly scars on his carefully built home, but they would have to do. Lynn, despite his protests, refused to remain idle. Her arm was in a sling, her movement stiff with pain, but she insisted on helping. She sat by the fire, her face set with concentration, methodically reloading every spent cartridge casing she could find. Her good hand moved with a deftness that spoke of long practice. They worked mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable, collaborative quiet. The barriers between them had been obliterated by the shared violence of the night before. He would bring her a cup of water, and she would nod her thanks. She would point out a weak spot in his barricade, and he would fix it without question. "They will use fire next time," she said in the afternoon, her gaze distant. "They will not risk coming in close again. They will burn us out." He knew she was right. The thought of his home, the one thing he had built with his own 2 hands, being consumed by flames filled him with a cold dread. But looking at her, at the quiet resolve on her face, he found that the dread was secondary to a different feeling, a fierce, unyielding determination. He had been fighting for his land, for his solitude. Now, he was fighting for her. He was fighting for the truth she carried in that oilskin packet. "We won't be here when they come," he said, the plan forming in his mind even as he spoke it. He looked around the wrecked interior of his home, at the life he had built, and accepted that it was already gone. It was a fortress, but it was also a trap. "We make our stand, but not in a cage," she looked at him, her dark eyes questioning. "When they light the fire," he explained, "it will be our cover. Smoke and confusion. They'll expect us to be trapped inside. We'll go out the back." Through the chaos it was a desperate gamble, but it was better than waiting to be burned alive. She considered his words, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes," she said. A cage of fire is still a cage. That evening, she showed him the ledgers. By the flickering lantern light, she opened the oilskin packet and spread the pages on the floor. They were filled with columns of names and numbers, all recorded in her neat, precise hand. She pointed to entries, her finger tracing the lines of corruption. Names of men who had died in accidents. Payrolls that were double the actual amount paid. Shipments of supplies that never arrived. It was a meticulous record of greed and murder. "This is why they are so afraid," she said softly. "This is proof." He looked at the damning evidence, and then at her. He finally understood the full weight of the burden she had carried all the way to his door. She wasn't just a survivor, she was an avenger. And he, a man who had only ever wanted to be left alone, was now a part of her war. The attack came just before dawn, in the grey, liminal hour between night and day. It began not with a gunshot, but with a soft, whooshing sound, followed by the bright, hungry blossoming of orange flame against the side of the house. Lynn had been right. They brought fire. Flint watched through a crack in the barricade as several men tossed burning torches onto the roof and against the walls. The dry timber, seasoned by years of wind and sun, caught quickly. Smoke began to seep through the walls, thin tendrils at first, then thick, choking clouds. "Now," he said, his voice tight. He grabbed his rifle and the satchel with the ledgers. Lynn, her face grim, the hatchet in her good hand, was right behind him. They moved to the back of the cabin, to the small window they had cleared. The air was already becoming thick and hard to breathe. The roar of the fire was a living thing, a hungry beast consuming his home. Outside, the attackers were positioned at the front, waiting for them to be driven out into their gun sights. It was the cover they needed. Flint kicked out the window frame and scrambled through, dropping to the snowy ground. He turned and helped Lynn, her face smudged with soot, her eyes wide in the firelight. For a moment, they crouched in the shadows of the burning cabin, the heat scorching their backs. The entire front of the house was engulfed in flames, a funeral pyre for the life he had known. There was no time for grief. He could see the silhouette of the railroad men, their attention fixed on the inferno. "Stay low," he whispered. "Move for the rocks." A cluster of large granite boulders 100 yards away offered the only viable cover. They ran, hunched over, their feet sinking into the snow. The smoke and the blinding light of the fire masked their escape. They were halfway to the rocks when a shout went up. They had been spotted. Gunshots erupted, bullets zipping past them, kicking up puffs of snow. They dove behind the largest boulder, hearts pounding, lungs burning from the smoke and the exertion. They were exposed, pinned down. The new foreman, a man whose name Flint didn't know, began to advance with 2 others, using the fire as their backdrop. This was it. The final confrontation. Flint laid the satchel with the ledgers at Lynn's feet. "Whatever happens," he said, meeting her gaze, "that doesn't fall into their hands." She clutched the hatchet, her knuckles white. "We will not fail." He sighted down his rifle. He had 4 shots left. There were 3 of them. The odds were long. The foreman was shouting, arrogant in his presumed victory. "Nowhere left to run. Give us the girl and the books, and we might let you live." Flint didn't answer. He waited. He watched the man's advance, tracked his movement, controlled his breathing. When the foreman paused to reload, Flint fired. The shot was perfect. The man dropped without a sound. The other two, stunned, immediately opened fire, their bullets sparking off the granite boulder. Flint was trapped. But Lynn wasn't. While the men were focused on him, she moved. She slipped around the other side of the boulder, a grey shadow against the snow, and charged. It was a suicidal, impossibly brave act. The first man turned, surprised, but not fast enough. She swung the hatchet in a low, vicious arc, striking his leg. He screamed and went down. The last man leveled his pistol at her. Flint rose from cover, roaring her name, and fired his last 3 shots in quick succession. The man jerked, hit twice, and fell backward into the snow. And then, silence. A deafening, absolute silence, broken only by the roar of the fire and the pained gasps of the man Lynn had wounded. It was over. Dawn broke, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of bruised purple and fragile pink. The fire had consumed the cabin completely, leaving only the stone chimney standing like a tombstone over a pile of smoldering black timbers. The barn was gone too. Everything he had built, everything he owned, was ash. Flint stood beside Lynn near the rocks, watching the ruin of his life. He was exhausted, his body a collection of aches and bruises, the gash on his arm a dull, throbbing reminder of the fight. Lynn leaned against the boulder, her face pale and smudged with soot, the bandaged shoulder a stark white against her dark clothing. She held the satchel with the ledgers clutched tight in her good hand. They were alive. They had won. But the victory felt hollow, paid for with a currency of blood and fire. The surviving railroad man, his leg crudely bandaged, was tied up and silent, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hatred. They would take him to the marshal in Cheyenne, along with the ledgers. Justice, or some version of it, would be served. But what came after? Flint looked at the horizon, the same horizon he had watched for years, searching for threats. Now the threat was gone, but so was everything else. He had nothing. No home, no plan, just the clothes on his back and the strange, quiet woman who had saved his life. He turned to her. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. "We'll need to find shelter before the next snow," he said. The words were practical, grounded, but they felt like the most important thing he had ever said. The subtext was clear. We. There was a we now. He wasn't alone anymore. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. It transformed her face, chasing away the exhaustion and the pain, revealing a glimpse of the woman she might have been if the world had been kinder. "I am not tired of running," she said, her voice soft but firm. Not with you. She held his gaze, and in that shared look, a new foundation was laid, not of timber and stone, but of something far stronger. It was a promise forged in gunpowder and fire, sealed in the quiet understanding that passed between two survivors who had found in each other the one thing they had both thought lost forever, a place to stand their ground. He reached out and his hand found hers, her fingers lacing through his. Her hand was small and cold, but her grip was strong. Together, they turned away from the ashes and began the long walk toward the town, two solitary figures stepping into the vast, uncertain landscape of a shared future.